Good evening, and welcome to the Sleepless Library, a quiet place where we share calming summaries of books to help you relax, unwind, and drift into sleep. Tonight, we're summarising Part 2 of Genghis Khan and the making of the modern world. If you missed Part 1, make sure you listen to the first part by following the link in the comments below. Before you wind down, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. And if there's a favourite book you'd like us to explore, let us know in the comments. Now get comfortable, dim the lights, and let your mind slow down as we ease into tonight's journey. Spitting on the Golden Khan. In the year 1210, on a vast plain beneath the eternal blue sky, Genghis Khan received an envoy from the mighty Chinese Jurched Jin Empire. This encounter would ignite a war that shook the world. The Jurched Emperor, the self-proclaimed Golden Khan of the Jin dynasty, had sent a haughty message. He expected the upstart Mongols to submit and pay tribute to him, as their ancestors once did. Surrounded by his chiefs, Genghis Khan listened to the demand and then did something shocking. He turned southward, toward China, and spat on the ground. In Mongol culture, spitting is a grave insult. By spitting, Genghis Khan wordlessly declared his contempt for the Jurchd's pretensions. He reportedly snarled a string of curses against the Golden Khan, then mounted his horse and galloped off, leaving the envoy in a cloud of dust. This dramatic gesture amounted to a declaration of war. The Golden Khan had expected obeisance. Instead, he got open defiance. Genghis Khan's pride would not allow him to bow. He had bowed to the Jurched as a young man when his patron Khan advised it, but now he was the master of millions and would kowtow to no one on earth. This confrontation set the stage for the Mongols' first major war outside Mongolia, the invasion of North China. Genghis Khan had united the Mongol tribes and subdued nearby peoples, like the Tanguts of Xixia, by 1209. Now his eyes turned to the far richer prize of the Jurched Jin dynasty, which ruled North China, including Beijing. For centuries, steppe nomads and Chinese farmers had a volatile relationship of trade, raiding, and uneasy tribute. The Jin emperors considered themselves the civilized centre of the universe, and the Mongols, in their view, were just another barbarian horde to be managed or crushed. They misjudged badly. By effectively demanding Genghis Khan's submission, the Jin lit the fuse of Mongol fury. In 1211, Genghis Khan summoned his tumans, army divisions, and prepared to march. But first, true to Mongol custom, he held a great Kurultai to let his people voice approval for the war. This was more than show. It was a way for the Mongol rank and file to buy in. News had spread of the Jin's insulting demand. Mongol pride was at stake. The Khan's pride was the nation's pride. If any Mongol families opposed such a risky venture as invading the formidable Jin Empire, they could simply not attend, thereby signalling dissent. Yet, they came. Warriors by the tens of thousands gathered on the steppe, eager for vengeance and plunder. The decision for war was unanimous by acclamation. Genghis Khan arrayed perhaps 100,000 horsemen for the campaign, including not only Mongols but also allied or conquered nomads, Turkic tribes, Khitan and Chinese deserters, etc. To face them, the Jin dynasty could muster hundreds of thousands of foot soldiers, crossbowmen, armoured cavalry and fortified cities behind massive walls. It was David versus Goliath, but this David had a few secret weapons, unprecedented mobility, a lifetime of hunting warfare on the steppe, and a leader of peerless strategic insight. The Mongol army crossed the Gobi Desert and breached the outer defence of China, the Great Wall. They found passes or simply bribed frontier guards to open gates. The Jin mobilised a huge force to stop them at the mountain pass of Yihuling, Wild Fox Ridge or Badgermouth Pass. Here, Genghis Khan employed one of his favourite ploys, the feigned retreat. He sent a portion of his army forward to skirmish, then pretend to flee in panic. The Jin commander, seeing the Mongols apparently on the run, led his massive army out of their fortified camp to pursue, confident of victory. The Mongols lured the Jin troops into difficult terrain, then suddenly turned at signal and encircled them. In the ensuing Battle of Yehuling, the Mongols annihilated a much larger Jin force, killing perhaps tens of thousands. It was a stunning victory, won by trickery, speed, and discipline. The Jin Empire's front line was shattered. Now Genghis Khan pushed into the rich plains of northern China. Mongol detachments swarmed over the land, capturing cities one by one. They adapted to siege warfare rapidly. Chinese engineers who had surrendered were put to work building catapults and siege towers. Under Mongol direction, they crafted giant crossbows to hurl rocks and explosives. The Mongols themselves devised clever tactics too. At the city of Zhongdu, Beijing, according to Persian chronicler Juvaini, they gathered 90 white horses to present as a feigned peace offering, while secretly positioning troops, an offer the Jin rejected, but it shows the Mongols' psychological approach. Often terror did the work. Genghis Khan believed in giving enemies a stark choice: surrender and be spared, or resist and face total destruction. Many towns took the first option. Those that chose the second met grisly fates. One such example is the city of Zhongshan. After stubborn resistance, it fell, and the Mongols reportedly killed every soldier and enslaved the rest. By contrast, the city of Kaifeng, the secondary capital, paid tribute and was left alone for the time being. Refugees from terrorized cities fled south, spreading panic and inflated rumors of Mongol numbers. The air black as night with the dust of cavalry, one witness wrote, as people truly thought demons had descended. The Mongols found the climate and terrain challenging. North China's summers are brutally hot and humid, not at all like Mongolia's cool, arid grassland. The Mongols and their shaggy steppe ponies suffered in the sticky heat. Many Mongol warriors fell ill with unfamiliar diseases amid the marshy, river-crossed farmlands. They also had trouble with the thickly cultivated fields, irrigation ditches and city walls that impeded their horses' mobility. Genghis Khan adjusted strategy. He avoided campaigning in the height of summer, often pulling his troops back to the cooler hills of Inner Mongolia during July-August. After resting in upland pastures, where they let their mounts graze and regained strength, the Mongols would sweep down again in autumn when conditions were more favourable. This seasonal rhythm allowed them to sustain a multi-year war far from home. By 1213 to 1214, the Mongols had taken most of Jin's northern territory. They surrounded the Jin capital, Zhongdu, Beijing. Inside the Great Walls, chaos reigned. The Jurched Emperor was a boy, with rival factions controlling the court. Seeing the hopeless situation, the Jin leadership opted for negotiation. They offered Genghis Khan an enormous ransom to spare the capital. Thousands of pounds of gold and silver, countless bolts of silk, and even 500 young men and women as slaves. They also formally acknowledged themselves as vassals of the Mongols and gave a princess in marriage. Genghis Khan agreed to these terms. In mid-1214, he withdrew his forces northward with wagons loaded high with loot. For a moment, peace returned. What prompted this seemingly lenient stance? Genghis Khan was a realist. Conquering a huge urban population was difficult. The Mongols excelled in war, not in administering cities. By accepting Jin's capitulation and tribute, he achieved his goals, plunder, submission, without having to occupy every city or leave garrisons. Perhaps he also thought the Jin dynasty, humbled and half-ruined, posed no further threat, and could be finished off later at his leisure. The Mongols were also itching to turn west, where new opportunities beckoned, better to secure a quick settlement in the east. However, this truce was short-lived. The Jin court, mortified at the humiliation, made a desperate decision that infuriated Genghis Khan. They moved their capital south to Kaifeng, abandoning Beijing Zhongdu entirely. In essence, they reneged on their vassalage and tried to hide behind distance. To Genghis, this was outright betrayal. He had spared Zhongdu partly to keep Jin as a client state. Now they'd bolted, breaking their oath. His anger was volcanic. As soon as the weather cooled enough for campaigning, In 1215 he marched back to Zhongdu, determined to make an example. Zhongdu's remaining garrison and populace knew what was coming. They had been spared once, now there would be no mercy. The Mongols stormed the city in spring 1215. After fierce fighting, Zhongdu fell. This time Genghis Khan unleashed total vengeance. The city was thoroughly pillaged and then burned. Contemporary accounts describe the streets awash in blood, great palaces set aflame, and Mongol soldiers herding terrified captives. Genghis allowed his troops a period of unbridled plunder, but even then he insisted on discipline. He stationed Mongol overseers outside the city to record all loot taken, ensuring shares were allocated fairly. When some of his allied troops, like Khitan auxiliaries, and even Mongol officers took bribes or tried to hoard treasure, he took action. For instance, his chief judge Shigi Kutuku discovered that officials, including the royal cook, had accepted embroidered silks as payoffs to let chaos continue inside the walls. Genghis Khan, upon hearing this, confiscated the goods and punished those responsible, though historical chronicles are vague, implying severe punishment, possibly execution or disgrace. This anecdote illustrates Genghis's peculiar balance of ferocity and order. He was ruthless, but not a mindless destroyer. He treated plunder like a military operation, to be carried out efficiently, with resources marshalled and distributed by rule, not squandered in drunken disorder. Legend has it that after Zhongdu's fall, sparrows and swallows could not find a single place to land in the city. It was filled with corpses. Genghis Khan had broken the back of the Jin dynasty. The Jurched emperor who had demanded Mongol submission was now a refugee in his southern domains, his northern empire completely wrecked. Genghis Khan wanted to ensure the land itself could no longer sustain the Jin. So he ordered something unprecedented: the transformation of North China's heartland back into steppe. Mongol riders trampled the croplands around the former capital, knocking down dikes and fences. They turned fields into pastures so nomad horses could graze freely and wild game would return. Towns along the old frontier were obliterated. This created a wide buffer zone, a depopulated strip separating Mongol-controlled territory from what remained of Jin China. Genghis Khan was essentially securing his conquest and punishing the earth itself for harbouring resistance. By mid-1215, the Mongols had conquered everything north of the Yellow River. The Jin dynasty was not completely extinguished. The Jurched kept ruling from Kaifeng for another decade, until Genghis's sons and the allied Song Chinese finished them off in 1234. But as far as Genghis Khan was concerned, the Golden Khan had been thoroughly humbled. The Mongols were now the supreme power of East Asia. For the first time in history, a nomadic army had taken the centre of Chinese civilization, not just raiding its edges, but subjugating its core. The aftermath of this victory was transformative for the Mongols. The flow of wealth from China to Mongolia was staggering. Caravans hauled so much silk north that the Mongols used silk in everyday ways previously unthinkable, as horse blankets, rope, even wrapping for other goods. Hundreds of skilled artisans, armourers, potters, doctors, scribes were captured and sent to Mongolia or attached to Mongol princes. One contemporary noted that the Mongol capital of Karakoram was now filled with the artists of China and Paris, vying to serve the Khan. Genghis Khan himself, however, remained a steppe warrior at heart. After sacking Zhongdu, he did not linger in the luxuries of Chinese palaces. Instead, he withdrew to the cool Ordos steppe by the Gobi. The Jin emperor had fled beyond reach for now. Genghis Khan had more pressing plans elsewhere. During the Chinese campaigns, Genghis had dispatched a trusted general, Jebe, to chase a rebellious Tangut prince west, which led Jebe inadvertently to clash with forces of the Khwarizm Empire in Central Asia. This opened a new front of interest. Additionally, Genghis Khan received envoys from as far as the Persian Gulf and Europe. During his war with Jin, the world was taking note of the Mongols. In 1218, he famously sent a large trade caravan to the Khwarizm Shah, seeking friendship and commerce. The Shah, tragically arrogant, massacred the caravan and later murdered Genghis's ambassadors. This atrocity gave Genghis Khan the righteous pretext for the next phase of his conquests, the invasion of the West, which he launched in 1219 with the same ferocity with which he had spat on the Golden Khan. Thus, the chapter of spitting on the Golden Khan ends with Mongol banners flying over northern China. The once mighty Jin dynasty had been effectively broken by Genghis Khan's whirlwind campaign from 1211 to 1215. The image of Genghis Khan literally spitting at the Chinese emperor's order encapsulates the Mongols' dramatic reversal of roles. The barbarians had refused to remain supplicants. Instead, they became conquerors. The Mongols had trodden the cherished cities of China under hoof, leaving an empire of ashes. In the process, they transformed themselves from a regional power into a world empire, and they gained momentum and confidence to carry their conquest to the far horizon. For now, Genghis Khan rode back to Mongolia, victorious. Envoys from distant lands began arriving to congratulate or size him up. One can picture him on the grassy banks of the Keralan, watching camels laden with silks arrive from Zhongdu. As messages came in from Khwarizm, or even from the Pope, he had redrawn the map of the known world, and he was just getting started. The Mongol World War, a term for the sprawling conflicts to follow, was about to commence, and Genghis Khan was poised to unleash it, armed with the riches of Cathay, the skills of conquered craftsmen, and a reputation that now struck terror and awe into all who heard his name. Sultan versus Khan. In the year 1218, a caravan of 450 Muslim merchants wended its way across the Asian steppe toward the flourishing cities of the Khwarizm Empire. They carried precious gifts, bolts of Chinese silk, pure white camel wool, silver bars and raw jade, treasures from the newly conquered East. Genghis Khan himself had dispatched this caravan, seeking a trade and friendship alliance with Khwarizm's ruler, Sultan Muhammad II. At that time, Khwarizm, which included modern Iran, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan and beyond, was one of the richest realms on earth. Its capital, Samarkand, glittered with turquoise domes. Its markets overflowed with spices and textiles. Genghis Khan imagined an exchange of goods and knowledge between his burgeoning empire and the Sultan's domain, two powers at opposite ends of the Silk Road. "Let there be peace and trade between us," Genghis wrote in a letter carried by the caravan. Little did he know that this overture would be met with treachery, and plunge the Mongols into their most epic war yet. When the caravan arrived at the border city of Otrar on the Syr-Darya River, tragedy struck. The local governor, a grasping man named Inalchuk, also called Gaya Khan, coveted the caravan's wealth. Accusing the merchants of being Mongol spies, he seized their goods and executed them. The news travelled swiftly back to Genghis Khan, who was shocked and outraged. Still, he offered the Sultan a chance to make amends. Genghis sent 3 ambassadors, 1 Muslim, 2 Mongol, to demand that the guilty governor be punished and the caravan losses repaid. Sultan Muhammad II made a fatal error. Not only did he refuse Genghis Khan's demand, he murdered the Mongol envoys and mutilated the Muslim one, cutting off his beard. According to chronicler Giovanni, Genghis Khan's anger became a whirlwind of fury that could only be quenched by rivers of blood. Enraged and resolved, Genghis Khan prayed on Burkan Khaldun as he had before, asking heaven for vengeance and strength. Then he began assembling his forces for what would become a 4-year war, 1219 to 1223, that ravaged Central and Western Asia. The Mongol World War had begun in earnest. In the autumn of 1219, Genghis Khan set out westward, heading for Khwarizm, the land of the insolent Sultan. This time, he did not just bring a raiding party. The full Mongol army advanced in multiple columns across the deserts and mountains. By the following spring, they burst like a storm into the oases of Transoxiana, the region beyond the Oxus River. What followed was one of the most devastating campaigns in history. The Mongols, like a falcon in a dovecote or wolves among sheep, tore through Khwarizm's cities. The names of those cities, Otra, Bukhara, Samarkand, Urgench, Balkh, Merv, Nishapur, Herat, and more, cascade through chronicles as a litany of destruction. It seemed no city, no matter how large or fortified, could resist the Mongols' onslaught. Genghis Khan divided his forces to cover more ground, a risky strategy that showcased his supreme confidence in Mongol mobility and intelligence. One general, Jebe, who earned the nickname Arrow after famously shooting Genghis's horse years earlier and then joining him, swung north to hunt the fleeing sultan. Another, Subutai, ranged wide to subdue the eastern steppe and check the cities of Persia. Genghis Khan himself led the main army into the heart of Transoxiana. The first major target was the ancient Silk Road oasis of Bukhara. Genghis Khan approached Bukhara not from the obvious route, but by an astonishing flank march across the Kizil-Kum desert. He did the impossible, pulling his heavy cavalry through a waterless waste that even caravans avoided. By befriending local steppe guides and moving in winter, when camels need less water and sparse grass grows, he achieved complete strategic surprise. In February 1220, the people of Bukhara were stunned to see dust on the horizon from the wrong direction. The Mongols had come from the desert behind them, not the expected road. A refugee from earlier battles galloped into Bukhara's citadel crying that demons were approaching. Panic ensued. Bukhara's garrison of Turkic soldiers abandoned the city's defence and fled out the opposite gate. The citizens threw open the gates and begged for mercy. Genghis Khan rode into Bukhara in a scene that has become legend. He entered the Grand Mosque, mistaken by him for the palace, one source says, and gathered the trembling inhabitants. Allegedly, standing atop the pulpit, he gave a speech. "O people, know that you have committed great sins. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent me as your punishment." Whether or not those exact words were spoken, the message was clear. Bukhara was now at the mercy of the great Khan. And mercy, for the most part, was not forthcoming. The city was thoroughly plundered. Treasures accumulated over millennia vanished into Mongol sacks. Skilled artisans and beautiful young men and women were enslaved and sent back to Mongolia. The city's soldiers, who had surrendered after a token resistance in the citadel, were executed or conscripted as human shields for the next assault. Many civilians were spared death. Genghis Khan often preferred to let the common folk live as taxpayers and labourers once their elite were killed, but their city was gutted of wealth. From Bukhara, Genghis Khan raced to Samarkand, the jewel of Transoxiana and Sultan Muhammad's capital. Samarkand was larger and better fortified, with reportedly 100,000 defenders including war elephants. But by now, Mongol reputation preceded them. Samarkand's walls held out for a mere 3 days before the defenders lost heart. On the 4th day, Samarkand surrendered. Here again, Genghis carried out thorough plunder and massacre of resisting troops. The Mongols feigned clemency to entice the garrison to lay down arms, then butchered the 30,000 surrendered soldiers as one cuts gourds, according to Juvayni's vivid chronicle. The ordinary civilians were largely spared slaughter, but all valuables were seized and tens of thousands of artisans and youths were marched off into captivity. The Sultan Muhammad II, terrified and discredited, fled deeper into his empire with a small retinue. Genghis Khan dispatched his top generals Jebe and Subutai to chase the Sultan to the ends of the earth. This extraordinary pursuit lasted 2 years and covered thousands of miles. The Sultan zigzagged through Persia and even across the Caspian Sea to an island, where he finally died in despair in early 1221. Jebe and Subutai, not content to return empty-handed, asked Genghis Khan for permission to scout further west, a reconnaissance that would lead them through the Caucasus and into Russia, where they would fight the Battle of Kalka River in 1223, Europe's first encounter with the Mongols. But that is another tale, to be covered in the next chapter. Back in the core Khwarizm lands, Genghis Khan still had unfinished business. the Sultan's brave son Jalal al-Din continued to resist in Persia and Afghanistan, rallying forces for a last stand. City by city, the Mongols ground down the Khwarezmian resistance. The numbering sequence of conquest listed by historians is almost exhausting. Merv, once called Queen of Cities, was stormed and its population annihilated. Some chroniclers claim 700,000 killed, likely exaggerated but indicative of enormous casualties. Nishapur, the cultured home of poets, fell after a Mongol commander and Genghis Khan's son-in-law was killed by a stray arrow. In fury, Genghis's daughter ordered every last inhabitant slaughtered, and the city razed such that no cat or dog remained alive. Genghis, the Sultan's birthplace, fought valiantly but was taken and subjected to one of the worst massacres of the age. Mongol soldiers reportedly had to wade through blood up to their stirrups. Genghis Khan often employed psychological warfare. At Urgench, he diverted the Oxus River to flood the city when direct assault took too long. The flood destroyed Urgench's walls and made its capture inevitable. By 1221, the Khwarezm Empire was effectively destroyed. Sultan Muhammad was dead. His son Jalal al-Din managed to gather a host and briefly defeat a Mongol force on the Indus River, but ultimately he too fled. Legend says he leapt his horse into the Indus to escape Genghis's onslaught, impressing Genghis Khan, who marvelled at the young prince's courage. Jalal al-Din vanished into India for a time, only to be later murdered by an assassin, thus ending the Khwarezm royal line. With Khwarezm vanquished, Genghis Khan's armies pushed in all directions. Subutai and Jibi rode far into the west, beating the Georgian kingdom in the Caucasus, and then defeating a coalition of Russian princes at the Battle of Kalka River in 1223. They disappeared from Europe as suddenly as they'd arrived, leaving behind terrified chronicles calling them Tatars from hell. Meanwhile, in the south, another Mongol detachment under Tolui, Genghis's youngest son, ravaged Afghanistan and northern India. Genghis Khan effectively conquered everything from the Himalayas to the Black Sea within those few years. The Muslim world was stunned. The great cities of Khorasan were in ruins. Baghdad's caliph, though untouched personally, lost many eastern provinces. In an ironic twist, some years earlier, the Caliph an-Nasir had reportedly, according to some sources, invited Genghis to attack Khwarezm because he hated the Sultan. A secret letter supposedly tattooed on a messenger's scalp. If true, that gambit succeeded far beyond expectations, unleashing catastrophe on fellow Muslims. Many in the Islamic world interpreted the Mongols as a scourge of God, punishing them for sins. They compared the invasion to the biblical Gog and Magog, apocalyptic hordes from the east. Why were the Mongols so unstoppable? Partly because the Khwarezm Sultan made grave mistakes, splitting his forces among cities instead of meeting the Mongols in open battle, mistrusting his best generals to the point of killing one on suspicion of treason and underestimating the Mongols' range and speed. But mostly, it was because Genghis Khan introduced a style of warfare unseen in the region. As one contemporary observed, they conquer by means of science, more than sheer numbers. The Mongols coordinated multiple armies over vast distances through a superb intelligence and relay network. They used feigned retreats, encirclements, and psychological terror to break much larger forces. They also showed a ruthless consistency in punishment. Cities that resisted were annihilated, which induced many others to surrender without a fight. Amidst the destruction, however, Genghis Khan was building something new. While he and his sons were dismantling Khwarezm, they were also laying foundations for a connected world. The Mongols deliberately spared scholars, artisans, and engineers, anyone with skills useful to the empire. Genghis created a kind of brain trust of captured talent. Chinese siege engineers, Persian astronomers, Nestorian Christian clerics, Uyghur scribes, and more. They exchanged knowledge under Mongol auspices. For instance, Chinese experts helped build better siege machines in the west, while Middle Eastern doctors went east to treat Mongol royalty. The Mongols also secured the Silk Road like never before. By eliminating rival powers and securing the routes from China to Persia, they enabled trade to flourish again once the dust settled. Marco Polo's father and uncle travelled to Kanbalik, Beijing during the Pax Mongolica that followed, a journey inconceivable under the patchwork of earlier states. By the end of the Khwarizm campaign in 1223, Genghis Khan controlled an empire stretching from the Yellow River to the Caucasus Mountains. It was the largest contiguous land empire in history up to that time, and it had been achieved with shocking swiftness. The secret to this success, as a contemporary scholar noted, was that war for the nomadic people was a sort of production. For the warriors it meant success and riches. The Mongol warriors were fighting not for a homeland or in self-defence, but for glory and booty promised by their Khan, and he delivered. Every victory brought them horses, slaves, gold and silk. This sustained their loyalty and ferocious will to fight. One might imagine that after subjugating such a vast realm, Genghis Khan would rest. But at about age 60, he was still hungry for conquest. There remained pockets of resistance, like the Tungut kingdom, whose king had snubbed a request for troops earlier. Genghis would deal with him in 1226 to 1227. And beyond Tungut lay the Song dynasty of southern China, the last big prize in the east. Plans were forming to take it as well, yet even the unstoppable Genghis Khan was mortal. The Khwarizm War took a toll. Years of ceaseless campaigning in harsh climates, from deserts to high mountain ranges, strained the great Khan and his forces. In 1222, as he mopped up the last rebellions, rumours suggest Genghis became ill, perhaps from riding through a region struck by the plague, or simply exhaustion. He returned to Mongolia with enormous booty, and held a celebration, a Nadam sports festival, to reward his men. Mongols, young and old, revelled in the bounty of victory. Genghis Khan, however, barely paused. By 1226 he was leading his army back into the field, this time against the Tangut to settle that old score. The Sultan versus Khan struggle was over, and Khan had won. The Sultanate of Khwarizm was utterly destroyed. It would never rise again. In its wake, the Mongols had redrawn the map of Asia. In the words of a Persian historian, the Mongols laid waste a world. But in doing so, they cleared the way for a new world, one interconnected under Mongol Pax, where an explorer like Columbus would later seek the great Khan's lands by sea, and where goods and ideas would flow as never before. The saga of Sultan versus Khan stands as one of history's great dramatic clashes, East versus West, Islam versus the pagan steppe, a proud emperor versus a world conqueror. It ended with the Sultan's empire in ruins, and the Mongol Empire ascendant, stretching over more land than even Alexander or Rome had ruled. As Genghis Khan camped by the Kurlan River in 1224, camels arriving with tribute from as far as Russia and Syria, he could reflect that he had indeed succeeded by means of science and sheer audacity where others would not even have tried. The nomad from Mongolia had become the master of the world from the Pacific to the Caspian, and though he had more to do and only a few years left to live, Genghis Khan had secured his legend for all time. The discovery and conquest of Europe. In the spring of 1221, two Mongol generals, Subutai and Jebi, sat astride their horses on a mountain pass in the Caucasus, gazing west toward the unknown lands of Europe. They had chased the Khwarizm prince across Persia and defeated every army sent against them. Now, with their Khan's blessing, they ventured further than any Mongol before, a reconnaissance in force into the fringes of Europe. For the peoples of Eastern Europe, this would be their first terrifying introduction to the Mongols, an event they would long remember as the sudden discovery of an enemy out of hell. What began as a probing raid by Jebe and Subutai would ultimately pave the way for the full Mongol conquest of Europe under Genghis Khan's successors. But even before the Mongols themselves arrived, Europe had heard distant echoes. Travellers' tales filtered back from the east speaking of a new power that destroyed Islam's mighty Khwarizm Empire. In 1221, a Franciscan friar in Hungary scribbled a curious note. The Tatars have captured the Rus and Russian princes. The whole world is in fear. Yet Western Europe remained largely ignorant, calling these mysterious warriors Tartars, after the medieval Latin word Tartarus, meaning hell, implying they were fiends from the underworld. That ignorance would soon vanish. The first European kingdom to directly encounter Mongol arms was the Kingdom of Georgia, a proud Christian realm south of the Caucasus. In 1221, as Subutai and Jibi circled the Caspian Sea in pursuit of Sultan Jalal al-Din, they stumbled upon Georgia's army. King Georgi II, the Brilliant, commanded a well-trained force hardened by wars against Muslims. Confident on their home terrain, the Georgians confronted the Mongols. The Mongols pretended to retreat in panic, the classic dogfight trick of feigned flight. The Georgian knights broke ranks to chase, sure of an easy route, but they fell into Subutai's trap. The lighter Mongol cavalry lured them out, then pivoted. With a thunder of hooves, fresh Mongol units under Jebe enveloped the overextended Georgians. In a few hours, the cream of Georgia's chivalry was slain. Georgia became the first European kingdom to bow to Mongol vassalage, its power permanently crippled. Flushed with this win, Subutai and Jebe pushed further. They swept through the Crimea, then north into the broad steppes of what is now Ukraine. There they encountered the nomadic Kipchaks, Cumans, Turkic cousins of the Mongols living as herders. Genghis Khan had often incorporated steppe kin like the Kipchaks into his forces, but these Kipchaks allied with the local Slavic princes against the strange invaders. Subutai, ever cunning, used diplomacy first. He contacted the Kipchaks and reminded them of steppe brotherhood, even bribing some to desert the Slavs. His divide-and-conquer tactic sowed distrust. Nevertheless, in 1223 a coalition of Russian princes from Kiev, Galich, Chernigov and more, together with Kipchak allies, marched out to confront the Mongols on the Kalka River near the Sea of Azov. The Russians significantly outnumbered Subutai's contingent, perhaps by 2-1. They were eager to avenge the ravaging of their neighbours' lands, but the Mongols were masters of manipulation. As they had with the Georgians, they made a small initial attack, then staged a long, calculated retreat eastward, luring the hot-headed Prince Mstislav of Kiev and others to give chase for 9 grueling days. The eager Russians became strung out over miles. Their heavy feudal cavalry, weighed down by mail armour and barded horses, could not catch the swift Mongols. Discipline faltered as each prince vied to be the first to catch the enemy. Exactly as Subutai intended, the Slavic host splintered into separated bands, exhausted and uncoordinated. At the Kalka River, the Mongols stopped and turned to fight on ground of their choosing. The Russians, strung out and tired, rushed into battle piecemeal. It was a disaster. Mongol horse archers galloped along the Russian line, showering deadly arrows. The heavily armoured Russian knights struggled to engage an enemy that danced just out of reach, cutting down infantry with impunity. When some Russian arrows fell short, the Mongols mockingly picked them up and shot them back. They had outranged their European counterparts. After softening the Russians with arrows, Subutai launched a full attack. Mongol lancers crashed into the disordered Russian ranks. The nomadic ponies outmanoeuvred the cumbersome European war horses. Their riders outshot and outfought the Russ's warriors. The Russian line crumbled. What turned into a chaotic rout, with Mongols riding down fleeing soldiers for miles. Princes of Kiev, Chernigov and others were captured or killed. It's said that out of perhaps 80,000 Russians, only 1 in 10 returned home. Subutai had achieved a brilliant victory with a relatively small force. The Mongols dealt the Russians a defeat unseen since the Viking invasions. But what truly horrified Europe was what happened afterward. As chronicled in the Hypatian Codex, the Mongols executed their noble captives in a chilling way. They laid out the captured Russian princes, including Mstislav of Kiev, and crushed them to death under wooden planks while Mongol commanders feasted on top. No blood was spilled, adhering to a Mongol aversion to shedding royal blood, but the princes died in agony as their celebrations rang out above. This act was intended to punish the killing of Mongol envoys by the Russians earlier. 10 Mongol ambassadors had been killed before the battle, violating Mongol laws of diplomacy. It also sent a grim message. Harming Mongol envoys would bring fates worse than death. In a twist of fate right after this triumph, news came that Genghis Khan had recalled Subutai and Jebe back east. By then Genghis was campaigning against the Tanguts and needed his generals. Without warning, the Mongol raiders vanished from the European steppe like a passing storm. They had no interest, yet, in occupying these distant lands. They had been on reconnaissance and punitive expeditions. Europe, for the moment, was spared further Mongol attacks. The Novgorod Chronicle famously recorded, "We do not know where they came from, nor where they have gone. Only God knows if they will return." To the Russians and Georgians, the Mongols were a chastisement from heaven, retribution for sins. One chronicler wrote, "For our sins unknown nations came and utterly destroyed our land." For about a decade after 1223, Europe had a reprieve as the Mongols focused on China and internal matters. But the threat lingered in memory. When Genghis Khan died in 1227, his heirs eventually resumed the western offensive. In 1236, a generation after Subutai's first raid, the Mongols returned under Genghis's grandson Batu and the great general Subutai, still active in his 60s, albeit now so heavy he rode in a cart. This time it was no reconnaissance. It was a full-scale invasion of Europe. Between 1237 and 1240, Batu and Subutai's armies systematically conquered the Russian principalities of the north. They besieged and sacked Ryazan, Vladimir, Kiev and others with terrifying efficiency. Wooden cities burned like tinder. At Kiev, for example, Mongol catapults pulverized its walls. Survivors spoke of mountains of skulls and an entire city emptied of life. By 1240, all Kievan Rus was under the Mongol yoke, the term later Russians would use to describe their 2 centuries of vassalage. The Mongol juggernaut rolled on into Central Europe. In 1241 they struck Poland and Hungary simultaneously. One Mongol wing defeated a combined force of Poles, Knights Templar, and Teutonic Knights at the Battle of Legnitz in Silesia. Legend says they gathered sacks of ears from the fallen as grisly trophies. Another, led by Batu and Subutai, annihilated the Hungarian army, with European Crusader knights among them, at the Battle of Mohi on the Sajo River in April 1241. European chronicles describe the sky black with Mongol arrows and the earth shaking under thousands of hoofbeats. The cream of Hungarian nobility was cut down. It seemed nothing could stop these invaders. The Mongols rode to the outskirts of Vienna, raiding deep into the Danube Valley. Panic seized Christendom. This was the feared scourge back again, on a grander scale. In October 1241, a solar eclipse turned the sun to darkness. Across Europe, people shuddered that it portended more calamity at the Mongols' hands. Then, as if by divine miracle, the Mongols halted. In spring 1242, news arrived that the great Khan Ögedei, Genghis's son who succeeded him, had died suddenly. By Mongol custom, all princes of the blood were required to return to Mongolia to elect his successor. Batu and the other commanders thus pulled back from Europe, marching east to attend the Kurultai. Just like Subutai's force in 1223, the main Mongol army now vanished from Europe, but this time they left conquered territories in their wake. Russia remained under Mongol dominance, though Poland and Hungary were spared annexation due to the withdrawal. Europeans, not understanding Mongol politics, credited the deliverance to God or the Virgin Mary. They never realized how narrowly Europe escaped complete subjugation. Nonetheless, the shock changed Europe. The myth of knightly invincibility was shattered. Mongols had wiped out knights as easily as they had Persian or Chinese armies. Chroniclers searching for explanations painted Mongols as punishment for sin, akin to the biblical scourge of God from the east. The invaders were said to have come from nowhere and returned to nowhere. In reality, by 1242, the Mongols established the Golden Horde in the Russian steppe, ruling over the Rus and Kipchak lands. but Western Europeans mostly saw them as an ephemeral storm, albeit one that could return. Yet the Mongols' brief presence had ripple effects. Europe and Mongolia now knew of each other. Envoys were soon exchanged. Within a few years, the Pope sent Friar Giovanni di Piano Carpini on a perilous journey to Karakoram to seek alliance, or at least gather intelligence. The Pope hoped to convert the Mongols or redirect their fury onto the Muslims. Carpini and later travellers like William of Rubruck returned with astonishing tales of the Mongol Empire's scale and sophistication. Marco Polo's father and uncle reached the court of Kublai Khan in the late 1260s, partly because the Mongols had made the Silk Road safe for travel after conquering everything in between. These contacts spurred a European desire for direct trade with the East, eventually leading to Columbus's voyage, who carried a copy of Polo's book and was seeking the Great Khan's lands by sea. Interestingly, Europe arguably benefited the most from the Pax Mongolica, without suffering full Mongol conquest. While the Middle East and China lost millions of lives, Europe gained new technologies and trade goods, often indirectly via the Mongols. The Mongols slaughtered the old aristocratic militaries. The mounted feudal knights in Poland and Hungary were decimated, which ironically helped end the feudal order. In the decades after, Europe adopted gunpowder, the recipe likely transmitted by Mongols, the compass, and possibly printing techniques, all catalysts for the Renaissance. They also imported Mongol fashion. Tartar cloth became prized luxury fabric. The very word hooray, some say, comes from the Mongol battle cry urak, introduced via contact during the invasions. One poignant consequence, the Mongols sold many captives as slaves to Italian merchants. Italian city-states like Genoa and Venice eagerly traded with the Golden Horde. They brought Slavic slaves to the Mediterranean. Indeed, slave comes from Slav. Ironically, many of these slaves ended up in Egypt, bolstering the Mamluk slave soldier class that would, in 1260, defeat a later Mongol army at Ain Jalut, the first decisive Mongol defeat, inflicted by men who perhaps learned war as captives of the Mongols. History's webs are intricate. By 1242, Europe breathed a sigh of relief and quickly forgot the Mongols' lessons. Chroniclers credited God's mercy for the Mongol withdrawal and did little to prepare should they return. Some decades later, in the late 1250s, Mongol forces under Hulagu, another of Genghis's grandsons, smashed the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad and threatened the Crusader states in Palestine. Fear revived. King Louis IX of France even sent an embassy to the Mongols to see if they might convert to Christianity, or at least spare Europe. That effort failed. The Mongol Khan demanded Louis' submission in return. But fortune favoured Europe again. The Mongols never launched a new full invasion west of Hungary. The great Khan Munka's death in 1259 halted Hulagu's advance, just as Ogyede's death halted Batu's in 1242. By the late 13th century, the Mongols had fragmented somewhat, and some, like Kubilai, were more focused on governing China than conquering new territory in Europe. Still, the spectre of the Tatars loomed for generations in European lore, an existential threat that could return. In truth, the Mongol Empire was gradually changing from a conquering force to a trading network, connecting continents in peace, the Pax Mongolica. The discovery of Europe by the Mongols and vice versa was a crucial step toward a globally connected world. Those initial collisions, Bukhara, Liegnitz, Mohi, Khalkha, were terrifying and destructive, but they broke the isolation of medieval Europe. From the Mongol perspective, Europe was just one front, a relatively poor one at that. After ravaging Hungary, Subutai reportedly described Europe's land as rich in pasture, but its cities as disappointingly lacking in loot compared to the Middle East or China. Indeed, the Mongols turned their main energies to the Middle East, defeating Baghdad in 1258, and internal struggles. Europe was lucky. As one historian later noted, although never ruled by the Mongols, in many ways Europe gained the most from their world system. They got the trade and technology with minimal Mongol occupation. By the dawn of the 14th century, the spectre of Mongol invasion faded and was replaced by fascination. European travellers marvelled at the grandeur of Kublai Khan's court. Marco Polo's accounts fired the imagination of many. Artists even romanticised Tartar fashions and designs. Chaucer, in the late 1300s, wrote admiringly of Genghis Khan in his Canterbury Tales, calling him "this noble king, this Tartar Genghis Khan," marvelling at how he kept so well royal estate. There was nowhere such another man. Quite a turnaround from the terrified chronicles of a century earlier. In summary, the Mongol discovery of Europe came in two thunderclap waves: Surbutai's raid of 1221 to 1223, and Batu's invasion of 1236 to 1242. The first shocked Europe's periphery, the second engulfed its heartland. Both left profound marks. Politically, they paved the way for the rise of Moscow under Mongol patronage. Since Kiev was destroyed, Moscow later became the nucleus of a new Russia. Culturally, they opened east-west contact, and psychologically they ended Europe's insularity. The Mongols taught Europe harsh lessons in warfare. Western armies learned to adapt by incorporating light cavalry and new tactics, and Europeans began using gunpowder weapons soon after, an invention transmitted along Mongol routes. In one of history's incredible conjunctures, the Mongol onslaught stopped at Europe's doorstep not because of European strength, but due to internal Mongol politics. "For our sins the Tartars came, and for our sins they left," wrote one Russian chronicler with relief. Europe was spared conquest, but it was forever changed by the brief but seminal encounter, and as we shall see, the Mongol Empire, now stretching from the Pacific to Eastern Europe, was entering a more settled phase, turning its energies to governing a vast realm and fostering a global awakening of trade and cultural exchange. In that process, Europe would become a major beneficiary. The thunder of Mongol hooves receded, but the vibrations of their world conquest continued to reshape the continent in subtler ways for centuries. Warring Queens. In the year 1241, as a Mongol army was ravaging Europe, news arrived on the steppes that Ögedei Khan, Genghis Khan's third son and chosen successor, had died. With that single event, the trajectory of Mongol history abruptly shifted from relentless expansion to internal power struggle. The Mongol Empire, the largest the world had known, suddenly had no great Khan at its helm. What followed was an extraordinary interlude in which the empire was effectively governed by a handful of powerful women, royal Mongol queens and widows, each jockeying to secure the throne for her own son. This epoch, roughly 1242 to 1251, has been aptly called the era of the Warring Queens, a decade when shrewd and ambitious Mongol empresses ruled the largest empire on earth. Mongol society, though patriarchal in warfare, actually granted women significant influence in politics and management. While the men were away conquering, women managed the empire's daily affairs. Genghis Khan had valued the counsel of his mother Helun and his chief wife Berta. Their wisdom often guided his decisions. It was customary for the great Khan's principal wife to act as regent if a Khan died and his heir was underage or absent. What was unprecedented in the 1240s was that multiple royal women simultaneously took control in different regions, then competed for ultimate supremacy. At the time of Ögedei's death, from binge drinking it was said, the Mongol Empire had 4 main branches corresponding to Genghis's 4 sons by Berta. Ögedei had been Great Khan, ruling the heartland, Mongolia and North China. His elder brother Chagatai ran Central Asia, the Chagatai Khanate. His younger brother Tolui had died in 1232, but Tolui's talented wife Sorkoktani governed North China and Mongolia in her late husband's name. Tolui's other brother Yoshi had died in Genghis's lifetime, but Yoshi's descendants under Batu controlled the western steppes, the emerging Golden Horde. Thus, by 1242, power was fragmented among Genghis's daughters-in-law. Turgen, widow of Ögedei, in Karakorum; Ebuskun, widow of Chagatai, in Turkestan; Sorkoktani, widow of Tolui, in North China, Mongolia; plus minor wives and princesses in various courts. These women were not figureheads. They were regents actively making policy, forging alliances, and yes, plotting against one another. When Ögedei died, his designated heir was a grandson via a favoured son. But that grandson was young and, crucially, not supported by Ögedei's wife, Turagene. Turagene Khatun had been Ögedei's chief wife and bore him several sons, including Guyuk. For many years she watched Ögedei favour other sons and even other wives' children. Now she saw her moment. In 1242, Turagene swiftly took the reins as regent of the empire. She installed her own loyal officials, purging many of Ögedei's trusted ministers. A key ally was Fatima, a captured Persian captive turned confidant, who became Turagene's secretary and perhaps sorceress advisor. Mongol chronicles suggest Fatima had eerie influence, sharing intimate confidences and hidden secrets with Turagene. Under Turagene's regency, 1242 to 1246, Karakoram's court was firmly under her thumb. All decisions flowed through the great empress. Turagene's main goal was to secure the great Khanate for her own son, Guyuk. But she faced rivals. The other branches of Genghis's family had their own candidates. Batu, Jochi's son in the west, disliked Guyuk due to feuds during the European campaign. Chagatai's family might prefer a Chagatid prince or one of Ögedei's other descendants. And quietly, Sorkoktani, Tolui's widow, favoured one of her own sons, like Munka, for the throne. It was high-stakes political chess, with the queens as players. Turagene spent 5 years shoring up support for Guyuk. She curried favour with Batu by sending him lavish gifts. Though Batu still distrusted Guyuk, they nearly came to blows in 1240. She convened a great Kuriltai in 1246 on her own terms. To that gathering came foreign dignitaries from far and wide, including the first envoys from Europe sent by the Pope. A massive tent city sprawled on the steppe near Karakoram as princes of the blood and generals arrived. The election of Guyuk was carefully stage-managed by Turagene. Notably, Batu of the Golden Horde refused to attend. He sent a representative, protesting the location being too far. But the quorum was met, and Guyuk, backed by his formidable mother, was duly proclaimed Great Khan in August 1246. The ceremony was an extravagant affair. One observer, Friar Carpini from the Pope, left a detailed record of the exotic rituals and international attendees. For a brief moment it seemed Turagene had triumphed. However, the story of the warring queens was not done. Guyuk turned out to be an austere, unforgiving ruler. He clashed with Batu almost immediately, and even planned a campaign against him. Before he could, Guyuk Khan died suddenly in 1248 under mysterious circumstances. Some say from drink or illness, others whisper perhaps poisoning. One theory, espoused in some chronicles, implicates Sorkoktani or her allies. Others say it was simply fate. Now the empire was leaderless again. Ogul Kaimish, Guyuk's widow, tried to hold power as Turagene had, but she lacked her mother-in-law's savvy. Also, in a fatal mistake, Ogul alienated the other Mongol princes by her arrogance and ineffectiveness. Meanwhile, Sorkoktani, Tolui's widow, made her move. Sorkoktani had ruled North China quietly and competently for years. Not only was she Genghis's daughter-in-law, she was also a Nestorian Christian, which gave her a certain outsider network. She courted Batu Khan of the Golden Horde, knowing Batu's voice would be key in the next Kurultai. Batu, who felt snubbed by Guyuk's regime, allied with Sorkoktani. Together they championed one of Tolui's sons, Munka, for the throne. In 1250 to 1251 the struggle culminated. Ogul Kaimish convened a Kurultai in Karakoram to try to get one of Guyuk's sons elected, but many key players, notably Batu and Sorkoktani's, faction did not attend, invalidating it. Instead, Batu organised a Kurultai on his own territory, where Sorkoktani and her sons came. In 1251, this assembly elected Munka Khan, Tolui's eldest, as Great Khan. effectively a coup against Ogul's line. Batu's army then marched east to enforce it. Ogul Kaimish was arrested and later executed in a particularly cruel manner. They sewed up every orifice of her body, symbolically stopping the flow of life, a horrific execution for a witch, as she was accused of sorcery. With her died the last hope of Ögedei's lineage ruling the empire. Thus saw Kochtani emerged as the ultimate victor among the warring queens. She had played the long game masterfully, maintaining a decade of peace in North China, supporting learning and administration. She famously sponsored printing of books and supported multiple religions, all while nurturing her son's prospects. When the moment came, she acted decisively in league with Batu. Once Munka took the throne, he honoured his mother Sorkoktani greatly, though she died only a year later in 1252, having achieved her life's ambition. Munka's rise marked the Toluid takeover of the empire. That branch, including Munka's brother Kublai, would rule henceforth. The era of the regents was effectively over. Never again would women hold the empire's apex power as they did in the 1240s. But their impact was profound. During their rule, the Mongol Empire did not fragment. Indeed, it experienced a needed decade of peace, consolidating after the frenzy of conquests. The queens managed governance, tax collection and diplomacy, even as they schemed against one another. They also patronised culture. Turgan had Buddhist texts printed. Sorkoktani supported Confucian scholars and Christian churches. Ogul Kaimish maintained the imperial appanages, though less effectively. Their leadership showcased how Mongol women could step into the void and command respect. European envoys like Karpini were astonished to see a woman, Turigane, at the helm of the empire when they arrived. It was not a bloodless contest. Rivals were eliminated brutally at times. When Gyuk came to power, he executed or humiliated many of his mother's enemies, like Temujin Ochagin, Genghis's brother, who had tried to seize power. Gyuk had him tried and killed. Munka, upon his accession, purged hundreds of Ögedei and Chagatai aristocrats who opposed him. It was said rivers of aristocratic blood flowed in Karakorum in 1252 as he rooted out conspirators who wanted Ögedei's family back. These purges effectively ended the warring queens' era by destroying the power base of those queens who lost. One could ask, what if the warring queens had not fought? Perhaps if Ögedei's initial heir had succeeded smoothly, the empire might have kept to Ögedei's line. But given the personalities involved, conflict was perhaps inevitable. Each Khan had multiple wives and thus multiple Khartuns with ambitions for their own progeny. The Mongol Empire was essentially a vast family patrimony, and the senior women were fierce guardians of their branch's interests. Despite the intrigue and occasional savagery, the legacy of these Mongol matriarchs is significant. They helped transition the empire from constant conquest to governance. They brought in outside talent. Many of the foreign administrators, Persians, Chinese, Uyghurs, who shaped Mongol imperial policy were elevated during the Queen's regencies. They also allowed time for the empire to digest its huge gains, a consolidation period. And in the end, they placed perhaps the most capable branch, Toluis, in charge. Munk and Kublai would go on to complete the conquest of China and further stabilise the empire. Sorkoktani in particular is revered by historians as an exemplar of wisdom. Even the Persian chronicler Atamalik Juvaini, who served Monkey, praised her as the most excellent of women, lauding her for raising her sons to be just rulers and for her generosity to the poor of many faiths. She famously declined remarriage after Tolui's death to focus on her children and govern her realm, demonstrating political acumen and restraint that won admiration even from those she displaced. By 1260, the time of queens in Mongol politics had largely passed. When Kublai Khan became Great Khan in 1260, his wife Chabi was influential, but not in an openly ruling capacity as Turgen or Sorkoktani had been. The empire had also begun to split into 4 separate khanates, each with its own customs. In some, women maintained influence. In others, like the staunchly Islamic Golden Horde, the role of women diminished due to cultural changes. In sum, the Warring Queens period, 1241 to 1251, was a remarkable decade where Mongol imperial power hung in the balance, and savvy royal women seized the reins. Their manoeuvres and statecraft kept the empire intact through a potential succession crisis that could have torn it apart. While they battled each other behind Yurts's curtains, with poison, politics, and proxies, they collectively demonstrated that leadership in the Mongol Empire was not exclusively a male arena. Genghis Khan himself would likely not have been surprised. After all, he owed much to his mother and wives, and indeed, thanks in part to these empresses, the empire he founded navigated its perilous mid-century transition and emerged under Menka and Kublai, poised for its final chapter, the age of global integration and cultural flowering, the subject of the next section, where the Mongol vision would extend from the steppes to the grand throne of China and beyond. Kublai Khan and the New Mongol Empire. It is the year 1260 in a grand hall at Shangdu, Xanadu, the summer capital on the edge of the Mongol heartland. A towering, broad-shouldered man in luxurious robes sits on a throne. His face carries the features of Genghis Khan's golden family, but he wears the silks of a Chinese emperor. This is Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan. At this assembly, Mongol nobles and foreign dignitaries alike kneel to acknowledge Kublai as the new great Khan. Unlike any Khan before, Kublai presides not just over yurts and steppe, but over cities and farms, palaces and bureaucrats. He is inheriting an empire that now includes all of North China, Korea, Mongolia, Tibet, and much of Central Asia. To the south stands the mighty Song dynasty, the last bastion of Chinese power unconquered. Kublai Khan, a visionary in his own right, is about to launch a new Mongol empire, blending the nomadic might of his ancestors with the cultured administration of China. Kublai's genius lay in recognizing that to rule the vast Chinese civilization, he could not rely on mere force alone. Genghis Khan had conquered through might, but even he had not fully subdued all of China. Kublai, though a warrior, was also a statesman. As one chronicler noted, he outsmarted everyone in his family. He realized that to truly govern China, which had more people in a single province than the entire Mongol steppe, he needed to win over the population and adopt effective Chinese practices. In short, Kublai aimed to become a legitimate Chinese emperor without ceasing to be a great Khan. After a fratricidal war, Kublai had to defeat his younger brother Arik Böke in a civil war from 1260 to 64 to secure his title. Kublai moved his main capital from Karakoram on the steppe to Dadu, Beijing in North China. In 1272 he officially named his Chinese dynasty Yuan, meaning great origin. He styled himself the rightful heir to the mandate of heaven, something no steppe conqueror had fully done. To cement this, he undertook symbolic acts. He built ancestral temples to honour his family in Chinese fashion. He gave his ancestors Chinese posthumous names and titles, effectively writing the Mongols into official Chinese history. He even had portraits of Genghis Khan and others painted in Chinese imperial style to present them as legitimate monarchs of China. Yet Kublai did not abandon his Mongol heritage. Like his grandfather, he kept the spirit banner of Genghis Khan flying and retained elite Mongol cavalry at his command. His challenge was to organise millions of disparate people into a single polity, something Genghis had done on the steppe with nomads. But Kublai had to do with settled populations of farmers, artisans and scholars, numbering in the tens of millions. Essentially, Kublai needed to build a state that could satisfy both his steppe Mongol followers and his new Chinese subjects. He tackled this systematically. Kublai harnessed Chinese bureaucracy. He adopted the Chinese imperial court's rituals and institutions. He recruited Confucian scholars and Buddhist monks into his administration, even as he kept key positions for Mongols and Central Asian Muslim advisors who were loyal to him. He famously reorganized the government to have Chinese heads with Mongol bodies, meaning Chinese advisors and administrators for each department, supervised by Mongol or foreign chiefs to ensure balance. One striking example: Kublai embraced the Chinese examination system in modified form, encouraging education, but he also created a new class of multilingual clerks drawn from across the empire. He had a new script created, the Pagspa script, to write all languages, an ambitious but not very successful attempt at a universal alphabet. He standardized weights and measures and expanded on his grandfather's tax and relay systems. Crucially, Kublai introduced a paper currency backed by the government's credibility, the world's first fiat paper money used as the primary medium of exchange across a huge empire. Marco Polo later marvelled at this in his travelogue. With these innovations, Kublai achieved what Genghis could not: the conquest and unification of all China. When Kublai took power, the Song dynasty still ruled southern China. It was a wealthy, well-governed realm with a formidable navy and populous cities like Hangzhou. Genghis Khan had deliberately not attacked Song after finishing off Jin, likely to avoid overstretch. But Kublai, who spent years governing northern China, understood Song's strengths and weaknesses. He waged a patient, systematic war from 1267 to 1279. He employed top Chinese engineers to build giant fleets of ships, since the Yangtze River and China's canals were Song strongholds. He recruited Chinese generals who defected from Song using their knowledge. The Mongol army, augmented by Chinese infantry and siege specialists, slowly pushed south. In 1276 they captured Hangzhou, the Song capital, peacefully accepting its surrender. The last Song loyalists resisted until 1279, when a final naval battle off Guangzhou ended with a tragic scene of the young boy emperor's loyal minister leaping into the sea with the child in his arms. China was unified under Kublai's Yuan dynasty, the first time in history that the entire land had been conquered by outsiders. Kublai had succeeded in fulfilling the dream of every Chinese leader. He united North and South China, yet he accomplished it not as a native dynasty, but as a Mongol one that cleverly adapted to Chinese norms. He moved the capital from Karakoram to Dadu, present-day Beijing, making it a showcase metropolis with both Mongol and Chinese influences. Marco Polo later rhapsodized about Kublai's capital as the greatest city on earth. One could say Kublai became more Chinese than the Chinese, at least outwardly. He took the reign name Jiyuan, complete beginning, signalling a new era, and named his dynasty Dayuan, which he announced carried heaven's mandate. But deep down he was still a descendant of Genghis Khan. He kept Mongol customs at court. Mongol was the language of the elite, for instance, and traditional Mongol dress and feasts persisted. He patronized not just Chinese Confucianism, but Tibetan Buddhism, Kublai's favorite faith, influenced by his Christian mother Sorghaghtani's, tolerance and his own tutor Pagspa Lama, and Nestorian Christianity and Islam among others. His administration included Persians, Uyghurs, Nestorian Christians from Central Asia, a truly cosmopolitan ruling class. Kublai's reign launched a new Mongol Empire phase, where Mongol rule transitioned from pure conquest to governance and integration. Under him, the empire reached perhaps its greatest stability and prosperity. The old Mongol world still existed, armies remained ever ready, and indeed Kublai tried to extend into Japan, Vietnam, Burma, Java. Some of these ventures failed disastrously, like the famous typhoon-wrecked invasions of Japan in 1274 and 1281 by the so-called kamikaze divine winds. But more enduring were his domestic achievements. Kublai instituted policies that fostered agriculture, easing taxes on farmers, providing relief, granaries during bad harvests. He expanded the Grand Canal to supply Beijing with rice from the south, and he built a dense network of roads and postal stations in China to mirror the steppe relay system. Despite his many successes, Kublai's embrace of Chinese ways also alienated some traditional Mongols. Notably, Kaidu, a grandson of Ogedei, led a Central Asian Mongol rebellion against Kublai's authority for years. The conflict between Kublai and Kaidu's line lasted throughout Kublai's life. Kublai nonetheless prevailed, though he had to station tens of thousands of troops in Mongolia to keep the frontier secure. Gradually the Mongol Empire was splitting into separate khanates. By Kubilay's later years, the Golden Horde, Chagatai Khanate, and Ilkhanate, Persia, all recognised him at least nominally as Great Khan, but acted independently. After 1294, his death, unity would never be restored. But during his reign, the empire still functioned as a kind of loose confederation, and trade and travel flowed freely from the Black Sea to the Yellow Sea. One of Kubilay's significant contributions was to demonstrate that Mongol rule could adapt and endure by fostering a hybrid civilization. The Yuan dynasty he founded in China lasted until 1368, nearly a century, and left deep impacts on Chinese history, from administrative divisions to social structure. For example, the Yuan's class system and encouragement of merchants raised the status of commerce in China, which had been frowned upon by earlier Confucian elites. Kubilay's reign saw the arrival of foreigners like Marco Polo, who carried stories of Asia back to Europe. The world became more interconnected, fulfilling perhaps an aspect of Genghis Khan's legacy in a way even Genghis might not have imagined, through cultural synthesis rather than just conquest. Yet, for all his cosmopolitan achievements, Kubilay never forgot his roots. He maintained the Mongol Great Taboo homeland as sacred. Though he relocated the capital, he still held gatherings at Karakoram and Burkhan Khaldun. He patronised Mongol shamans alongside Buddhist lamas and was reportedly uneasy about death rituals and such. He let Chinese officials carry out ancestor ceremonies while he kept a distance, as Mongols traditionally avoided sites of death. In sum, Kublai Khan's era, 1260 to 1294, marks the transformation of the Mongol Empire into a more settled administrative empire, one that would leave an enormous footprint on East Asia. Under Kubilay's new Mongol Empire, China was united and given its modern boundaries roughly. Trade across Eurasia was at an all-time high, the Silk Road bustling with caravans and the sea routes opened as well, and a truly global exchange of ideas commenced. Kubilay's court itself was a microcosm of the known world. Persian astronomers built observatories in Beijing, Muslim doctors ran hospitals, a Christian named Marsergius became an official envoy, and artisans from all over crafted the luxurious goods admired by visitors like Polo. However, the Mongols remained a separate ruling class, never fully assimilating. Kubilay's Chinese-style rule still had Mongol sensibilities. Mongols didn't let Chinese officials into the highest posts of military or government decisions, and Mongol law, yasa, remained in effect although tempered. Many Chinese resented Mongol rule, and after Kubilay's death this discontent would grow, leading eventually to the rise of native rebellions, like the Red Turban Rebellion that birthed the Ming. But while Kubilay lived, he held the empire strong, the mightiest man in the world in subjects, territory and treasure, as Marco Polo described him. It was said no one had ever ruled such a vast realm with such wealth. Indeed, Kubilay's Yuan Empire was the first truly continental empire spanning Asia's breadth, governing both nomads and farmers, Christians and Buddhists, in a relatively stable order. This new Mongol Empire had a different character than the empire of Genghis's time. If one were to step into Kubilay's capital, one would see Mongol guards and horses, but also Confucian scholars with scrolls, Persian envoys in silk robes, Tibetan monks chanting prayers, Chinese painters and poets employed at court. It was a cosmopolitan cosmopolis, likely the largest, most diverse court on earth at that time. Genghis Khan's conquests had connected the world. Kubilai Khan's rule gave that connection a rich cultural and administrative structure. However, with Kubilay's death in 1294, the unity began to crack. The Khanates drifted apart. The Chinese resentments he managed to keep in check began to boil up. And the global awakening that his peace allowed would soon reveal both the Mongols' legacy and their limitations. But that global awakening, the spread of knowledge, technology and art across Eurasia, would be the subject of the next chapter as we explore the golden light of cross-cultural exchange that shone under and after Kubilay's reign. Their golden light. In the late 13th century, a remarkable scene unfolded in the royal courts of Europe. A Mongol envoy named Rabban Barsauma, a Christian monk from Beijing, was received with honour by King Edward I of England during Mass. The king even stood up to take communion from the hand of this visitor from the far side of the world. It was an astonishing encounter, an Asian ambassador administering a sacred Christian rite to an English king. Rabban Barsauma had journeyed over 7,000 miles from the Mongol capital to Europe, carrying gifts and letters from Kublai Khan and the Mongol ruler of Persia to the Pope and kings of France and England. This event symbolises the extraordinary global connections forged under Mongol rule, a time when the artists of China and Paris vied with each other in the service of the great Khan, as one historian put it. The Mongol Empire at its height created what modern scholars call the Pax Mongolica, a century of relative peace and free trade across Eurasia. After so much conquest and destruction, the Mongols turned to rebuilding and linking the world. The result was a global awakening, an unprecedented surge in exchange of goods, technology and ideas across continents. The Mongols themselves, once pure nomads, became patrons of sedentary arts and sciences. They delighted in golden light. Gold itself, yes, but also the metaphorical light of knowledge, faith and culture. The Mongols were remarkably religiously tolerant and culturally open. Under their rule, a traveller like Marco Polo could venture from Venice to China and back, relatively safely. Indeed, Marco Polo's father and uncle had in 1260 carried a friendly letter from Kublai Khan to the Pope asking for 100 learned men to teach the Mongols about Christianity and Western science. Few were sent, but the exchange shows the curiosity. Polo's return to China with young Marco in 1275 and his long sojourn at Kublai's court exemplify this global fluidity. Artisans, scholars and merchants roamed freely under Mongol protection. Persian astronomers built observatories in Kublai's Beijing. Chinese engineers went to Iran to share expertise on irrigation and catapults. Muslim doctors served in Mongol hospitals in China. The Mongols even relocated entire communities of craftsmen. After sacking cities, they often spared and transplanted weavers, potters, miners, and makers of marvels, like siege weapons and luxury goods, to wherever skills were needed. One vivid symbol of this global mix, the Ilkhanid court in Persia, Hulagu's descendants, employed Chinese artists to decorate their palaces, and their vizier Rashid al-Din compiled a landmark historical work, the Compendium of Chronicles, drawing on information from across the empire, including even a history of the Franks. In Mongol Persia, paper money was tried, inspired by Kublai's experiment, and Chinese medical texts were translated into Persian. In China, Mongol administrators compiled huge geographical encyclopedias, and possibly thanks to Persian influence, China in the Yuan era saw advancements in astronomy. The Persian Jamal al-Din built sophisticated observatories and celestial globes in Beijing. From the Middle East to China, the Mongol peace allowed trade caravans to move unmolested. Polos marvelled at how one could travel from the Black Sea to the Pacific under one rule, with regular relay stations providing fresh horses and food. The Mongol postal system, Yam, was like the nervous system of this world, carrying not just messages but also news, travellers, and intelligence at speeds unheard of before. Europe, though never ruled by the Mongols, drank deeply from these new streams. Gunpowder, which Mongols used in China and transmitted west, arrived in Europe in the 13th century, and within decades Europeans invented cannons. By 1346, the English used cannon at Crécy, a direct result of Mongol-facilitated tech transfer. Printing techniques and the compass also reached Europe, spurring the Renaissance. Even something as mundane as trousers, originally a nomadic steppe attire, became common in Europe. By late Middle Ages, European men wore Mongol-style jackets and pants, rather than classical tunics and togas. Consider language. The word hooray, as a cheer, is believed by some to come from the Mongol battle cry hurry, or similar, picked up by Europeans via the Mongols. Musical instruments like the bowed string fiddle came from the steppe, the Mongol horsehead fiddle, and influenced European fiddles just violins. Foods travelled too. Pasta often cited as possibly coming from China, though contested, and dumplings or ravioli might share ancestry with Mongol booze or Chinese baozi. Art blossomed from cross-pollination. In Yuan China, painters experimented with Middle Eastern cobalt blue glazes on porcelain, creating the iconic blue and white Ming pottery style. Mongols brought cobalt from Persia. Ilkhanid Persian miniatures suddenly adopted Chinese elements like dragons and clouds. European painting also felt an influx. Motifs like the Mongol phoenix or clothing styles appear in early Renaissance art. For instance, some scholars argue that fabrics depicted in Giotto's paintings have Mongol patterns, reflecting new silk imports. Religion too benefited in curious ways. Franciscan friars like John of Plano Carpini and William of Rubruck travelled to convert the Mongols, but ended up learning about Asian spirituality. Rubruck famously debated Buddhism and Islam at Möngke Khan's court with wise men of those faiths, a medieval interfaith dialogue orchestrated by the Mongols. Mongols allowed Nestorian Christianity to flourish in China and Central Asia. Kubilai's own mother was Christian. They built mosques and churches along their routes, even financing a church in Beijing and a mosque in the Crimean steppe. The Mongols didn't impose a religion. They treated all as different fingers of the same hand under eternal blue sky, which was novel tolerance in that era. Europeans like Rubruck were astonished to find Muslims, Buddhists, and Christians coexisting amicably at the Khan's court, each praying for the Khan in their own way. By around 1300, the results of this global exchange were clear. Europe was emerging from its parochial feudal age into the dynamic Renaissance. The Islamic world was recovering and advancing with new knowledge, like Chinese gunpowder and paper-making. China under the Yuan was arguably at its most cosmopolitan, with influences from Persian astronomy to European glass-blowing present. The great medieval world system, as some historians call it, was born, with the Mongols as its midwife. But after 1300, the Mongol Empire's unity frayed. Different Khanates sometimes warred with each other, e.g. Golden Horde versus Ilkhanate. The Black Death in the 1340s, which itself spread along trade routes likely facilitated by Mongol openness, devastated populations from China to Europe. Mongol rule in China collapsed by 1368, in Persia by 1335. Yet the structures they built did not vanish altogether. The successor states and societies carried on much of that exchange. The Silk Road never returned to the closed, fragmented state pre-Mongols. It remained open until sea routes eventually took over. Many Mongols assimilated locally. The Mughal dynasty in India, a Mongol-Turkic branch, fostered another golden era of art and tolerance in the 16th century, claiming Genghis as ancestor. Looking at Europe specifically, by the mid-14th century, Europeans had gained significant benefits from the Mongol-spurred globalization: printing, explosive powder, navigational compasses, paper, new crops like citrus and carrots, and even a boost to their economy through easier trade. The wealth of the Italian maritime republics in this period came from trade reopened with Asia. Christopher Columbus in 1492 was explicitly trying to reach Cathay, China, and the land of the Great Khan. He even carried a letter from Spanish monarchs to the Great Khan, not realizing the Mongol Yuan dynasty had fallen long ago. Columbus's copy of Marco Polo's travels, with his own annotations, reveals how deeply the memory of the Mongols had fired European imaginations. In a way, Columbus was chasing the echo of Mongol grandeur across the ocean. Thus, the Mongol legacy helped spark the age of exploration. Europeans seeking the wealth of the East described by Polo, which the Mongols had unveiled to them. The phrase, their golden light, evokes the idea that the Mongols, once feared as destroyers, became carriers of civilization's light. One 13th century European observer, Roger Bacon, wrote that the Mongols succeeded not just by arms but by science, being open to learning from every culture. Geoffrey Chaucer in the 14th century wrote in awe of Genghis Khan's achievements and portrayed him positively, a far cry from the barbarian stereotype. The Mongols, through the connections they forged, indirectly helped end Europe's Dark Ages and usher in the modern era of global intercommunication. By 1368, Mongol rule in China had ended. In 1370, in Central Asia. By 1500, only fragments like the Crimea and the steppes remained under their descendants. But the vibrations of that bell Genghis Khan rang, the bell of a connected world, continued to tingle through time. Mongols faded, but their golden light, the trade routes, the cultural exchanges, the spread of technologies, illuminated the path forward for humanity. In the epilogue that follows, we will see how the Mongols' legacy persisted, sometimes hidden, sometimes celebrated, and how modern Mongolia has re-embraced Genghis Khan's spirit after centuries of forgetting. But looking at the Mongol century of dominion, one can fairly say that Genghis Khan and his successors made the modern world possible by knitting together the once isolated continents, unleashing a flood of golden light that has never entirely been extinguished. Epilogue: The Eternal Spirit of Genghis Khan. In the dawn chill of a Mongolian summer morning, the wind rustles the feathergrass of the steppe, and a lone horsehair banner flutters beneath the endless blue sky. Locals say that in the wispy clouds overhead, one can still imagine the spirit banner of Genghis Khan waving, his soul ever present in the homeland he loved. 8 centuries have passed since the great Khan rode these plains, yet his memory in Mongolia today feels alive and immediate. The Mongols have a saying, "We are the children of the golden light, the offspring of a wolf and a doe." They see themselves as heirs to Genghis Khan's spirit, as part of an unbroken lineage stretching back to that humble herder boy who remade the world. For a long time, however, the world, and even the Mongols themselves, forgot or distorted the true legacy of Genghis Khan. After the Mongol Empire collapsed, new dynasties often painted the Mongols as purely destructive barbarians. In China, the Ming erased positive references to the Yuan. In Persia, writers emphasized the trauma of the invasions. In Europe, Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire demonized Genghis as a brutal conqueror, conveniently overlooking the trade and knowledge his empire spread. As centuries passed, the nuanced reality of Genghis Khan, lawgiver, civilizer, innovator, faded beneath the crude caricature of a bloodthirsty savage. In Mongolia itself, under centuries of Chinese and later Soviet domination, Genghis Khan's name was suppressed. The Great Taboo, his guarded burial area, remained closed, and in the 20th century the communist government banned public discussion of him. Only in 1990, with the democratic revolution in Mongolia and the collapse of the Soviet Union, did Mongolians freely speak of their national hero again. When they did, it was like a flood of cultural revival. The airport in Ulaanbaatar was named Genghis Khan Airport. His portrait went up in government halls. Children began learning his true history in school. The Mongolian people had rediscovered their eternal spirit. What is that spirit? Genghis Khan's spirit lies in the ideals he personified: unyielding ambition, unity out of diversity, and an audacious openness to new ideas. Mongolia today, a small nation of just 3 million, takes pride that their ancestors once connected the world. In 2006, on the 800th anniversary of the Great Khan's enthronement, Ulaanbaatar unveiled an enormous equestrian statue of Genghis Khan, gleaming in stainless steel, the largest of its kind in the world. People make pilgrimages to it, not out of militarism, but out of respect for the father of their nation who gave them identity and pride. The Mongol nomads of today still feel Genghis's presence in their daily lives. They tie blue prayer scarves to ovus, sacred cairns, on mountain tops, just as Genghis did when he prayed at Burkhan Khaldun. They race horses at Nadam festivals in honour of Genghis's warriors' skills. They sing folk songs about Genghis Khan's relics and the glory of the Mongol Empire. One modern song laments, "We imagined your appearance, but our minds were blank." It captures how for generations Mongols had only vague tales of Genghis because foreigners had hidden or destroyed the records. But now, armed with newfound historical knowledge, like the deciphered secret history of the Mongols, they can vividly imagine their great ancestor again. In the wider world, Genghis Khan's legacy is being reappraised too. Historians note that he shaped the modern world more than any other conqueror. He connected East and West, spread technologies, and even inadvertently facilitated the European rise, as we saw. As one scholar put it, he shattered the protective walls that isolated civilizations and knotted the world together. More and more people today recognise that while Genghis Khan's conquests were brutal, they paved the way for the Renaissance in our interconnected global society. The eternal spirit of Genghis Khan, then, is not about conquest per se, but about the human drive for exploration, innovation, and unity. He once said, according to legend, "The greatest happiness is to scatter your enemy and drive him before you," the grim warrior creed. But he also showed another side, granting religious freedom, abolishing torture, welcoming merchants, codifying laws for all to obey equally. Those progressive policies are also part of his spirit. At the dawn of the 21st century, as if to symbolically close a circle, Mongolia invited representatives of all the peoples once in the empire to a grand celebration. In 2006, delegations from China, Central Asia, even descendants of the Golden Horde in Russia, came to Mongolia to honour Genghis Khan. The Mongols sacrificed horses in ritual, drank airag, fermented mare's milk, and read from the secret history. It was as if Genghis's spirit banner once again summoned his people, not for war but for remembrance. In one sense, Genghis Khan's body is still missing. His tomb has never been found, possibly in Khenti province, still undeveloped. Perhaps it's better that way. The earth of Mongolia is his mausoleum. The Mongols believe the body doesn't matter. His soul is in the sacred wind, in the holy mountain, in the very identity of Mongolia. As a modern Mongolian writer asked, "Is it our fault we have forgotten our history?" The answer is no. The memory was taken, but now it's restored. And what of the world he changed? Even after the Mongol Empire fell, many of its ideas took root. The concept of international law, diplomatic immunity, passports, the ideal of meritocratic rule, as Genghis promoted, however imperfectly, the reality of multiple religions coexisting in one polity. These are hallmarks of the modern world system. Pax Mongolica's legacy can be seen in everything from the European use of gunpowder to the global spread of printing and paper money. Today, Genghis Khan is no longer seen as just a scourge. Statues of him stand not only in Ulaanbaatar, but in London, as part of a Conquerors exhibit, and even in Nevada, USA, at the Mongolian-themed resort. He's been the subject of books reassessing him as a statesman, and indeed, Jack Weatherford, whose work guided our understanding, titles him the maker of the modern world. It is a profound claim, but as we have witnessed through these chapters, not an exaggerated one. As one stands on the steps of Khenti at dusk, one might imagine hearing hoofbeats on the horizon. When I close my eyes, I can still hear the distant thunder of his horses' hooves as they gallop off to China, Europe and India, writes Weatherford. In truth, the resonance of Genghis Khan's era still echoes. The hoofbeats are metaphorical now. They are the sound of nations trading, cultures mingling, information flowing across the earth that he once united. The eternal blue sky still arches over Mongolia as it did in Genghis's youth, and under it the Mongol people thrive and remember. Genghis Khan's physical empire may have dissolved, but his spirit, a spirit of boldness, curiosity and world-changing ambition, remains eternal, inspiring future generations across the globe. In Mongolia, they like to say Genghis Khan's spirit lives in every Mongol's heart, as a drop of ancient horseman's blood, and in every gust of steppe wind as a whisper of destiny. That spirit, the eternal spirit of Genghis Khan, continues to ride on, challenging us to broaden our horizons and connect with one another, just as he connected the world so long ago. The conqueror is long gone, but his legacy, like his spirit banner, will forever wave in the chronicles of human history. Thank you for joining us at the Sleepless Library. Don't forget to subscribe to be notified when Part 2 of Genghis Khan is released. We hope these quiet thoughts helped you drift a little closer to rest. Sleep well,